Fox News special presentation of The Cost of Freedom. Shutdown. What's up? Now, live from New York, Neil Cavuto.
Well, day 5 and the government is still shut down. Today, though, we are open for business, asking simply, what's up? And whether these guys are any closer to a deal. Because while this storm may be losing steam, well, this one is not. Welcome, everybody. Glad to have you on what will be a very busy Cost of Freedom. I'm Neil Cavuto, where at this hour, we could see a vote in the House that actually has support from both sides of the aisle, even the President of the United States, to, in this case, fund back pay for furloughed workers. Is this a sign of progress, or does the store and the deal-making close right here? We're on it. In fact, we're everywhere. In Washington, with Chad Pergram at the Capitol and Ed Henry at the White House. In Chicago, with Sandra Smith monitoring the markets. In New York, with Jonas Max Ferris monitoring the same markets. And in London, with Stephen Pope on the global fallout. And throughout the next 2 hours, we'll be getting reaction from Utah Senator Mike Lee, who's at the center of this political storm. Texas Democratic Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, whose controversial comments started creating another storm. Michigan Republican Governor Rick Snyder, who predicted this coming storm. And the former Treasury Secretary John Snow on what in 2 weeks could be a far, far bigger storm. We begin with Chad on the Capitol, where they're minutes away from voting on something, at least for now, both sides agree on. Explain.
Right. There's going to be a vote here in just a little bit about, making sure that those federal workers who are furloughed off the job get back pay. It's sponsored by Jim Moran, who's a Democratic congressman from Virginia, also Frank Wolf, a Republican from Virginia. They represent a lot of federal workers who are affected by this. And they say, look, these guys are off the job. They didn't do anything wrong. We want to make sure that they get back pay here. And prospectively, this would go over to the Senate. The Senate doesn't meet until noon, and the Senate may, in fact, pass this by unanimous consent. But that's really the only work that's going to be done here at the Capitol today. Woody Allen used to say that 80% of life was just showing up. Well, this is the 80%, just showing up. Yeah. The fact that Congress, if they weren't in, it would be bad optics. So they have to do a little something here, and that's the 20% of making sure the workers get the back pay.
But there's nothing that you could see on the horizon, or at least say the immediate horizon, that indicates that they're making progress on eventually opening the government up.
Absolutely not. Everybody seems to be locked in a cryogenic freeze right now. I mean, there's no negotiation going on, no back channel talks or anything. I think what's been interesting here is that, the issue of Obamacare and tying this to keeping the government open, those two issues have been wedded. And until there's a divorce between those, there are not the votes on the Republican side of the aisle in the House of Representatives to reopen the government. Republicans are a little bit optimistic privately, though. They say, this issue is going to kick into the debt ceiling here in just a couple of weeks. And in 1995, when we had the shutdown, all of the discussion was about spending, the top line. We've heard very little about that in this. But when we pivot to the debt ceiling in a couple of weeks, then the discussion will be about spending and trying to cut spending. And that's where Republicans think that they can actually make some hay. That's where they can make some progress, because they usually win when it comes to the spending issues, because people want smaller government.
Chad, thank you very, very much. We will be returning to you as developments warrant. You might have heard Chad referring to this debt ceiling. It refers to the point sometime in October. We're told October 17, when the government effectively runs out of money. It'll be down to its last $30 billion, whatever it can find under couch cushions, and has to raise that debt ceiling. Therein lies the battle that will really be the one royale. To Ed Henry, who normally would have been accompanying the president on his way to Beautiful Valley, maybe to see these ladies. If we can take a look here, but that's not going to be the case. I never understood these dances anyway, Ed, but bottom line, you're going to be robbed of a chance to share in this cultural excitement. But you're outside the White House now, with the very latest on anything going on there today.
Yeah, the real story is my wife canceled that trip to Asia, not the government shutdown, Neil, as you look at that video. No, I mean, look, as Chad talks about the fact that Republicans would like to eventually get this to a spending fight, that's been something the White House has been sort of bemused by, which is that it's been all about health care and not about spending and debt, which is what Republicans have been saying since 2011. They want to be their focus in terms of tying it to the debt ceiling. Look, long term, neither side really has a tenable position. I mean, for the president to go publicly over the last couple of days and say, look, I'll negotiate with anybody. But yet when he went behind closed doors a few nights ago here at the White House with congressional leaders in both parties, all accounts, he said, I'm not going to negotiate over the debt ceiling. I'm not going to negotiate over the government shutdown. You've got to just reopen the government, and you've got to have straight up or down vote to lift the debt ceiling, no strings attached on health care or anything else. And if you look at the president's numbers, he's down to 41% in the latest Gallup poll in terms of an approval rating. So can he continue to say, look, I'm not going to negotiate on these things? Meanwhile, John Boehner, can he continue to tie those two together in terms of health care and shutting the government down, as Chad was just laying out, when if you look at the Quinnipiac poll from a couple of days ago, it was saying, number one, the president had problems selling the health care law because it was something like 49% to 43% said they don't like the new health care law. But by 72% in that same Quinnipiac poll said they don't like, the American people don't like tying health care changes to this whole government shutdown stuff. So that long term, what's John Boehner's next move? I think the bottom line is there was actually a somewhat positive development over the last 24 hours that hasn't gotten enough attention, which is Speaker Boehner letting it leak out that he's not going to let the nation default. Why is he doing that? Number one, he's trying to reassure the markets. Number two, he's trying to put a line in the sand to his fellow Republicans that, look, he was willing to bring this to a government shutdown, but he realizes that default is sort of uncharted territory and doesn't want to be the Speaker of the House who lets the nation default, just as the president has said he doesn't want a default on his watch. So that's actually something both sides finally agree on. The question to me is, what will they swap here? You know, will the president, in the end, even though he's saying he's not going to negotiate, will he give a wink and a nod and say, look, I'll give you more spending cuts if you just reopen the government and you lift the debt ceiling with no other strings attached? What does Boehner want to sort of save face politically, but also substantively to get something out of the White House that he feels will be a good bargain? So we might not have a grand bargain, as we've heard so many times, but maybe it's grand bargain light or something like that, Neil.
I like that, grand bargain light. Ed Henry, thank you very much. As Ed was speaking here, we're getting ribs and drabs of the interview the president has conducted with the Associated Press, in which he talks about how he still wants to reach an agreement with the Republicans, and that he's very confident that the $16.7 trillion debt ceiling will get raised in mid-October and avoid a default. But we should hasten to add here, simply going past that deadline does not mean you default. You default if you don't make good on an interest payment to bondholders. Technically, that would do it, something we've never done in our history. But we've gone past these debt ceiling deadlines many times. They're not pretty. They're not easy. In fact, they're never desired. But that doesn't automatically mean you're in default. You're only in default with the money you have left, and you choose not to prioritize your bond obligations and pay off debtors. If you do that, then you're no good. You look like a deadbeat. The world sells you off. Interest rates skyrocket. It's the end of the world. You might as well put cyanide in your breakfast and call it a day. But we're a long way from that. Bill Johnson joins us right now, the retired Heinz chairman, president, CEO. Bill, we get to that point, then obviously all bets are off. But I always like to remind people that it takes a leap to start getting to that leap. The scaremongering is what's got to stop. What do you think?
Well, you can't negotiate and you can't lead while you're trying to shame the other people and you're trying to frighten everybody. But Yogi Berra said it best. It's deja vu all over again. Neil, we're back to this point where we were a year ago with the fiscal cliff, and prior to that with the stimulus, and prior to that with TARP. You know, this seems to be an ever-going thing in Washington, D.C. I think it was Will Rogers that once said he didn't write jokes. He just reported on the facts out of the government in Washington, D.C. And that's what we have here, and you can't negotiate when you've created a climate that's so destructive as we've done now. And frankly, what ought to happen and what would happen in a business is that the four leaders in the Congress, along with the president, should lock themselves in a room and not come out until this thing is resolved. All right.
We're going to get to this later in the show, Bill, but I did want to just pick your brain on this notion that what does it say about the confidence that's out there and how the world thinks of us? Right now, our markets have been pretty steady. Our bond market's been steady. No one's been selling in mass or running like crazy. But that's because they all expect this to be resolved, and they don't expect this to drag on. They certainly don't expect us to default on our obligations. But we assumed the same thing a couple of years ago when none of us envisioned our AAA rating getting knocked for a loop when Standard & Poor's did just that. So are we a little too cocky here?
Well, I think we're a little too confident, but the markets generally believe that this is going to be resolved because it's always been resolved in the past. And every time you say history is not going to repeat or this time's different, it hasn't been proven true. I think the difference this time, though, is that each side seems to have drawn an intractable line in the sand and doesn't seem to want to cross it. And that has put an air of destructiveness in the negotiating process that really isn't allowing people to move ideas forward. And after all, that's what solves these problems. You know, Confucius is the one who said, fix problem, not blame. And we're spending so much time trying to blame everybody for what problems we have now that we're not putting the collective wisdom and judgment together of the people in D.C. and, frankly, the general business population to try to resolve this issue. And I can tell you, as you know, having run an international company, people around the world are staring at us trying to figure out exactly what it is we can't resolve. And ultimately, it will affect business confidence. And ultimately, if this thing doesn't show signs of resolution, the markets will feel the pain.
Who does business blame more for this, or does it care? It just says, you all look like children.
I think that's exactly what it says, Neil. I don't think business is blaming anybody. Again, you know, think about this. We haven't passed a budget since 2009. Imagine me as CEO going to my board of directors and saying, by the way, I don't have a budget this year. I just want a continuing resolution. So would you approve my spending on top of what I spent last year? I mean, you wouldn't last 25 minutes as a CEO. And until we have a budget and a mark in the sand, all this stuff is very difficult. So from my perspective, I think the business community is looking at Washington, D.C. as functionally broke and saying to itself, if they can't solve this problem, we're going to have to figure out ways to do this on our own. But clearly, no side is winning on this issue, despite what you hear in terms of postulating coming out of the White House or out of the Republicans. I think both sides look ridiculous.
Bill Johnson, good catching up with you. Thank you very, very much.
You too, Neil. Thanks.